The day my brother walked out of the attorney's office with a smile on his face was the same day I decided to stop fighting. Not because I was giving up, not because I was weak, because I finally understood that the best thing I could do for myself, for my future, for the version of me that still wanted to sleep at night, was to let him have it. All of it. My lawyer thought I'd lost my mind. My best friend cried on the phone for 20 minutes straight. And my brother thought he'd won. He hadn't. But that part took a while to unfold. I need to back up, because this story doesn't make sense unless you understand where I came from and what the business actually meant to our family. My grandfather built Mercer & Sons Supply out of nothing. Literally nothing. He immigrated from rural Georgia up to Ohio in his late 20s, started with a flatbed truck and a handshake deal with a local hardware distributor, and spent 30 years turning it into a regional wholesale operation that supplied contractors, builders, and municipalities across 3 counties. When he died in 2009, the whole thing passed to my father. My father was not my grandfather. That's not a cruel thing to say. It's just true. Dad was a good man, gentle, quiet, someone who liked fishing on Sundays and never raised his voice at us growing up. But he had no appetite for the grind of running a business. Grandpa had left behind a company that required constant attention. Vendor negotiations, fleet maintenance, insurance renewals, payroll, and Dad treated it like an heirloom he was afraid to touch. For about 4 years, he managed to keep it mostly afloat by relying on the people Grandpa had put in place. But those people retired or moved on, and Dad didn't replace them with people who knew what they were doing. He replaced them with whoever was cheapest and closest. By the time I graduated from Ohio State in 2014, Mercer & Sons was bleeding. I came home that summer for what I thought was a 2-week visit. I stayed for 11 years. I don't say that with bitterness. I made the choice. Dad sat me down at the kitchen table, same table we'd had since I was 7, and spread out a stack of papers that I recognized even then as the kind of documents you call an accountant about at 2 in the morning. Delinquent vendor accounts, a balloon payment on a business loan coming due in 8 months, 2 employees who hadn't been properly classified for tax purposes and were now subjects of an IRS inquiry. I don't know what to do, he said. He wasn't asking me to fix it. He was just being honest. But I looked at those papers, and I looked at him, and I thought about Grandpa, who I'd spent summers with, who taught me how to read a balance sheet before I knew what algebra was, and I said, let me help. My stepbrother was 22 that year, fresh out of a semester at Columbus State that hadn't gone well. He was living in the apartment above the garage, spending most of his time with his friends, occasionally showing up at the warehouse to help, in ways that mostly meant he moved boxes for an hour and then left early. Nobody asked him to step up. He didn't offer, so it was me. Over the next few years, I did what needed to be done. I renegotiated every vendor contract. I worked with a CPA to resolve the IRS situation, which cost us a significant penalty but could have cost us far more. I brought in a fleet management company to restructure the truck maintenance schedule, which cut our breakdown costs by almost 40%. I took a salary that was less than what I could have made anywhere else, because the business needed cash, not another expense. And slowly, not dramatically, not overnight, Mercer & Sons started to breathe again. Not 2019, we were but solid. We had 12 full-time employees, a solid set books, and a reputation in the county that my grandfather would have recognized. Dad was proud. He said so, often. He also, somewhere around that time, started talking about what happened to the business after he was gone. He never made it a formal conversation. That was very him, to leave important things soft and unfinished. But he would say things at dinner or driving somewhere that made his meaning clear. You're the one who saved this place, he told me once. That should count for something. I didn't push him to put it in writing. I probably should have. In 2021, my brother came back. He'd been in Phoenix for a few years, doing something in logistics. Not our kind, the tech-adjacent kind. And when that company folded during the supply chain chaos of the early pandemic years, he came home. Different energy than before, more polished, more confident. He started coming to the warehouse, asking questions, sitting in on vendor calls. I was glad to have him. I genuinely was. I thought finally he's ready to be part of this. What I didn't realize was that he was also quietly building a relationship with Dad that was less about the business and more about the inheritance. Dad had a health scare in the spring of 2022. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but enough to make him think seriously about his will, about estate planning, about what he wanted to leave behind and to whom. My brother was there for all of those conversations. I was running the business. When Dad sat us both down in August of that year and told us what he had decided, I felt the floor shift under me. He was splitting the business 50-50 between us, equal shares, equal ownership. I sat there and I did the math in my head. 8 years. 8 years of my salary being reinvested. 8 years of decisions and stress and vendor calls and IRS negotiations. 8 years of being the person who showed up. And my brother, who had been back for about 14 months, was receiving the same share. I didn't say anything in that meeting. I think Dad expected me to be grateful, or at least neutral, and part of me understood his reasoning. This was his father's company, and we were both his children, and maybe he felt that equal felt fair in a way that the numbers couldn't capture. But equal wasn't fair. It just looked like it was. I called my lawyer that evening, not to be vindictive, just because I needed to understand what my options were. What she told me was useful, because of my role in the business over those 8 years. Because I had been, functionally, the operating partner, there was a legitimate argument to be made for what's called a sweat equity claim. Not guaranteed, not simple, but real. She also told me something else. She told me to look very carefully at the operating agreement my grandfather had drafted when the business was first incorporated and the amendments that had been added over the years. Because in old family businesses like this one, there were often provisions that the current owners had long since forgotten about. I started reading, and that's when everything began to change. My brother and I had about 4 months of what I would call an uneasy partnership. We were co-owners on paper, which meant every significant business decision required both of us. I had made those decisions alone for years. Now suddenly I needed consensus for things I had been handling in my sleep. He had ideas, some of them weren't bad, but he also had a habit of treating the business like it was already his personal ATM. He started expensing things I would never have expensed. A conference in Denver that had nothing to do with our industry. A lease on a company truck he was clearly using for personal errands, a consulting contract with a friend of his that I couldn't trace to any actual deliverable. I documented everything, calmly, quietly, without confrontation. I kept a spreadsheet. The blow-up came in January of 2023, when he proposed that we bring in an outside investor to scale the business. The investor he had in mind was someone he knew personally, and the terms he outlined would have diluted my stake without an equivalent increase in value. It was the kind of deal that sounded exciting in a pitch deck and would have been disastrous in practice. I said no. He said I was being obstructionist, resistant to growth, stuck in the past. I said I was being responsible. He filed a formal complaint with the business's registered legal agent, claiming I was mismanaging the company and blocking legitimate growth opportunities. He hired an attorney, and here is where it gets complicated, because my brother's attorney was good. He was aggressive and well prepared, and the complaint he filed was specific enough that it couldn't just be dismissed. My lawyer told me we were looking at a protracted dispute, potentially a forced buyout or a court-ordered partition of the business, neither of which would leave either of us in a good position. You should counter hard, she told me. You have the sweat equity argument. You have the documentation. You have 8 years of financial records that show what you built. I heard her, and I thought about it for a long time, and then I said, let him have it. She went quiet on the phone. For so long I thought we'd been disconnected. I'm sorry. If he wants to run this business, I said, let him. I'll sign over my share. I'll walk away. That is not what I would advise, she said. I know, but I'm not asking for your advice right now. I'm asking you to help me understand what conditions I can attach to the transfer. Another pause. Okay, she said slowly. Let's talk about conditions. Here is what most people don't know about a closely held family business that's been operating for 40+ years. The obligations don't disappear just because ownership changes hands. My grandfather's original incorporation documents, the ones I had been reading for weeks by this point, contained several provisions that had never been updated or removed. One of them was a clawback clause related to a deal he had made with the county in the 1980s. In exchange for preferred access to certain municipal contracts, the company had agreed to maintain a minimum number of full-time employees and to preserve certain operational standards. That agreement had been renewed quietly, almost automatically, 3 times since then, including once during my tenure, when I had signed the renewal without fully understanding its long-term implications. That clause was still active. There was also the matter of a $340,000 SBA loan that my father had taken out in 2017 to purchase a new warehouse facility. The loan was tied to the business, not to Dad personally, but as a 50% owner, if that ownership transferred, the new sole owner would be taking on full liability. And there was the pension obligation. 3 of our longest tenured employees, men who had worked for the company since my grandfather's era, had been promised a pension supplement upon retirement. It wasn't a formal ERISA plan. It was a written promise in their employment agreements, the kind that would be legally enforceable if challenged. Those 3 men were within 5 years of retirement age. The total projected obligation was somewhere around $280,000. My brother's attorney had not asked about any of this. My attorney, once she understood my plan, spent 2 weeks doing what she called a full liability audit. She was thorough and honest. "He's going to be blindsided," she said. "I know," I said, "and you're sure you want to do this?" I told her what I had decided. I wasn't trying to destroy my brother. I wasn't trying to set a trap. I was simply making a decision. If he wanted this company, they'd have it. All of it. Every asset and every obligation exactly as it was. The transfer agreement I signed was clean and complete. No carve-outs, no special protections for me. I walked away from everything, the equipment, the contracts, the accounts receivable, the goodwill, the name. I also walked away from the debt, the clawback clause, the pension obligations, and the SBA loan. All of it transferred with the share. The closing happened on a Thursday morning at my attorney's office. My brother came in confident. His attorney was the one who had been aggressive for months, who had drafted the complaint, who had pushed hard for this resolution. He had what he wanted. His client was getting the business. My attorney and I sat across from them and said very little. The documents were thick. My brother didn't read them. He flipped to the signature pages, asked his attorney if everything was in order. His attorney said yes. But then my attorney handed over the exhibits, the full liability schedule, the SBA loan documentation, the municipal contract with the clawback clause, the pension supplement agreements with the projected obligation timeline. My brother's attorney went quiet. He started reading, really reading. I watched his face change. He asked for a recess. They stepped out into the hallway. Through the glass partition, I could see his attorney talking quietly, but with a kind of controlled urgency that I recognized from the many vendor negotiations I had run over the years. The kind of talking that means the situation is not what you thought it was. They came back 20 minutes later. My brother looked at me and said, "You knew about all of this." "I've been running this company for 8 years," I said. "Yes, I knew. You're doing this on purpose." I looked at him for a moment and I thought about how to answer that, because it was both true and not true at the same time. "I'm signing over my share of the business," I said, "exactly the way Dad gave it to us. Every asset, every obligation. That's what ownership means." His attorney tried to renegotiate. He suggested we restructure the transfer so that the pension obligations were shared, or that the SBA loan liability remained split. My attorney was patient but firm. The terms of the transfer were what they were, and I had already agreed to them. What my brother hadn't anticipated was that the person he thought was retreating had actually been preparing. He had 48 hours to decide whether to proceed. He called me the next morning. I was in my car outside a coffee shop, and I let it ring twice before I picked up. I was calm. I had been calm for a long time, actually. Since the moment I made this decision, a kind of steadiness had settled into me that I hadn't felt in years. You can't just dump all of this on me, he said. I'm not dumping anything, I said. I'm giving you what you asked for. I didn't know about the pension thing, or the county clause. I know you didn't. He was quiet for a moment. So what am I supposed to do with a $340,000 loan and employees I have to keep on just to satisfy some contract from the 80s? Run the business, I said. That's what ownership is. Another long silence. You've been doing all of this for 8 years. Yes, I said. And you never. He stopped, started again. Why didn't you ever say it was that hard? I looked out through my windshield at the gray January sky, and I thought about how to answer that question. Because it was the first real question he'd asked me in a very long time. Because I didn't want to make it a competition, I said. I just wanted the business to survive. He didn't respond to that. Eventually he said, what if we went back to the original structure, 50-50, like Dad said? I had expected this. I had thought about it for weeks before this call came. I'll come back, I said, under a different structure. I want to be compensated for what I've actually contributed. I want my role defined formally in writing. And I want a buyout clause so that if this doesn't work, either of us can exit cleanly. That sounds like you want to be my boss. No, I said. That sounds like I want a contract, which is what we should have had from the beginning. It took 3 months and several more attorney meetings to reach an agreement we could both live with. The final structure wasn't 50-50. It was 60-40 in my favor with a defined management role, a salary that reflected 8 years of back compensation calculated at a reasonable market rate, and a clear operating agreement that outlined decision-making authority for everything from major expenditures to new hires. My brother's attorney negotiated hard. So did mine. But there was a difference now in how the negotiations felt, because the balance of information had shifted. My brother finally understood what the business actually was and what it cost to run it. The pension obligations were addressed in the new agreement, split proportionally, funded over time, properly documented in a way they never had been before. The SBA loan was restructured with the bank to reflect the new ownership arrangement. The county clause, it turned out, was already in compliance. We had never fallen below the minimum employee threshold, but knowing it existed changed how my brother thought about layoffs and staffing decisions, which was probably the most important lesson of all. I'm not going to tell you that everything is perfect now. Family businesses are not like other businesses, and the hurt from those months doesn't evaporate because the paperwork is signed. There are still moments. A comment he makes at a team meeting, a decision he tries to push through without consulting me, when I feel the old frustration come back. And I imagine he has his own version of that too, his own grievances, his own story of how this all unfolded. But what's different now is that we have a structure. We have a document that says, in plain language, what we each owe each other and what we each are entitled to. We have a process for when we disagree and a way out if it becomes untenable. My grandfather built something that survived him. I don't know if it'll survive us, but I know that when I walk into that warehouse now, I walk in as someone who chose to be there, not someone who felt she had no other choice. That difference matters more than I expected it to. There was a moment, about 2 weeks after the new agreement was signed, when I was doing what I still do every Monday morning. Walking the floor before anyone else arrives, checking inventory, looking at the week's dispatch schedule. It was early February, still dark at 6:30, and the overhead lights in the warehouse make everything look a little amber, a little old, like a photograph. I stood there for a minute and I thought about my grandfather, who had stood in a different warehouse, in a different county, with nothing but a truck and a handshake and an idea about what he wanted to build. I thought, he would have understood exactly what I did, and why. Not because it was clever, not because it worked out, but because the one thing he believed in more than contracts or obligations or revenue figures was that you can't care more about something than the people who are supposed to own it. I cared, and eventually my brother started to, as well. That's not the ending I expected, but it's the one I'll take.